Super. Let's go ahead and kick it off. My name is Emily Sun, and I'm with Place Matters. Place Matters is a capacity builder and accelerator of cross-sector place-based change work, with a big focus on learning as a key agent for change and inspiration. So, one of the events that we do are these sort of webinars where we invite people with interesting perspectives and experience to share those with the audience, and hopefully also we get to hear from the audience as well. So I'm delighted that today's topic has attracted so much interest. It is going to be, what I'm sure is going to be a dynamic discussion about collaborative leadership, and also what might be necessary beyond collaborative leadership as well. I think it's generally accepted now that real change at the place level can't happen without understanding and shifting the broader system, which holds the long-standing challenges and issues, but it also holds the potential and opportunities for the future. So it's now much more accepted that sort of top-down, siloed leadership cannot address the more complex issues that our communities face. And that collaboration is essential, especially across public, private, community, voluntary sector groups and organizations. But I think it's also probably a cliche to say collaboration is really tough, and it can be quite challenging. So we'll dig in a little bit more around what are the challenges and what are the enablers for truly collaborative work that can shift systems. And then just to make another, put another challenge in there, we're going to ask the question, well, is collaborative leadership enough? Or does it take more to really disrupt systems and bring about real transformative change, especially during very disruptive times, which I think everyone feels we are going through now. So those are the sort of the main theme that we'll be touching on. And the format will be that we have three brilliant speakers who will engage in a good chat and debate. And then we'll have time at the end for your questions. So please feel free to put some questions into the chat as we go along. And we will have some time to hopefully answer as many of them as possible from the panelist viewpoint at the end. So with that, I'm just going to introduce our lovely speakers today. Liz Weaver is co-CEO of Tamarack Institute. Many of you, I'm sure, know and have heard of Tamarack. They've been a real leader for the past 20 years in advancing community change efforts. And they focus on 5 key areas and many more, but the 5 core areas are collective impact, collaborative leadership, community engagement, community innovation, and evaluating community impact. Liz herself is incredibly well-known and a prolific writer of learning that she gathers from across multiple communities that they work with. So I'm sure many of you have read her publications. Elle Dodd joins us as a senior head of practice at Collaborate CIC, which exists to help public services collaborate to tackle complex social changes. And Elle herself has really led and collaborated on place-based work in Essex, Dumfries, Liverpool City region, and many more communities, that's just naming a few. And she brings a really extensive sort of policy and systems change background from both local and national government, so tying those two levels of government together, and really leads on Collaborate systems leadership practice. So lovely to have you with us too, Elle. And last but not least, Nick is CEO of Community Organisers. And their mission is to ignite social action in communities, embed community organizing locally, and develop a strong network and sustainable future for neighborhood community organizing. So he spent the past 12 years working in some of the most economically challenged communities across England and works as an advisor to various government departments, as well as national community sector groups on citizen participation and community organizing and many others. So Nick, I understand that you're also being pulled more and more into European forums to share good practice and good learning. So it's lovely to have you as well. So thank you again, Elle, Nick, Liz, for joining us. And I'm just going to kick off then with a first question. And I'm going to invite Elle to give her thoughts on this first, and then invite the other two as well. But in your view, what exactly is collaborative leadership? And why do you think it is so critical to place-based change?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks all for joining, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all in the room, and kind of taking the invitation from this question to start fairly basic and to try and help us all get onto the same page. So apologies for those of you for whom this is your daily bread and butter, but I'm going to start with kind of what this means to me and why I think it's important. So for me, leadership in general is the activity of mobilizing change. It's an action that you choose to take, not a position or a role that you're given. And that might seem like semantics, but it's quite important because it means that anyone can lead, can be a leader, can exercise leadership, not just those in positions of power or authority. And that what it means to lead is to mobilize change, and that requires a much broader set of things than skills, attitudes, behaviors than you might traditionally have associated with people in so-called leadership positions. So just to set that as the kind of grounding, when I talk about collaborative leadership, I'm talking about a collective effort of mobilizing change. And collaboration in various forms is essential for mobilizing change. You can see at the most basic level, and the sort of activity of mobilizing change is about recognizing and seeing the situation that you're in, trying to understand what might be causing the problems and trying to do something about it, and trying to check back to see if what you did made a difference. And there are lots and lots of fancy models to describe that kind of
Elle, I'm just going to stop you and pause you very briefly. I think there's some sound in the background, so if everyone can mute themselves, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Sorry, Elle, go ahead.
No problem. And so there are lots of kind of fancy models to describe that cycle, but I call it the observe, interpret, intervene cycle as a kind of easy way of reminding myself what we're trying to do. And you can see that at a personal level, you need other people to help you do that job well, to help you see things that are hidden from your view or shielded by your own biases, to challenge you with competing hypotheses about what might be causing the problem, and to act alongside you, multiplying your impact and doing things that you cannot do to mobilize the change that you're trying to see. But at a place level, when we're talking about place-based change, it's even more important because most of the situations we're trying to intervene in are really complex. And by that, I mean that the outcomes we're seeking to influence are determined by a web of interconnected people, organizations, processes, structures, which make it very difficult to determine, let alone agree, the precise cause and effect of the different problems and their potential solutions. And the dynamic and interconnected nature of that system means that it's beyond the control of any one person or service or organization to determine those outcomes. And in fact, often the system changes so rapidly that it's almost impossible to map, let alone control that system. So I'll give you a bit of an example, and I could pick pretty much any social problem. We're currently working with delayed speech development in toddlers, obesity in deprived neighborhoods, homelessness, multiple disadvantage, reoffending, loneliness, and mental health, to name but a few kind of examples. But to pick from that one that might be almost more simplistic, if you like, imagine that you're a senior manager in an NHS hospital trust. And on a day in a week like this, I'm not sure many of us would want that job, but that one of the many problems that you currently face is trying to bring down waiting lists, particularly for things like orthopedic surgery, where people need hip replacements, knee replacements, etc. This is an issue fairly dear to my heart, as my mom is currently on one of these waiting lists. And you have within your control, as the manager of that NHS trust, prioritization of those patients, allocation of surgeons and operating theatres, but that's only ever going to deal with the flow of patients from the waiting list to recovery, if you like. You have little control over the rest of that system that shapes the flow of patients onto the waiting list to begin with. And that's influenced by GP referrals, but also by factors well beyond the control of the NHS, like individual fitness decisions, social attitudes to pain management, availability of physiotherapy services, tripping hazards in domestic staircases and height of street curbs, and probably a dozen other things that I, as not an expert in this area, can't think of. But you as a hospital manager can't easily work out which of those is the cause, so to speak, nor can you readily do pretty much anything about most of them. But what you can do is collaborate with others across your place to influence, support, and mobilize the change needed to tackle it together. And as you can start to deduce from that one example, that partnership might be with the local council, who's got influence over the built environment or social care, but it likely needs to be much wider than that, engaging people with the musculoskeletal conditions themselves at different stages in their life cycle, and the private and voluntary sector who provide care and support to those people, other medical and exercise professionals, maybe even local media and opinion formers shaping public attitudes, etc. And those are very different actors with very varied capacity, perspectives, incentives. And the art of collaborative leadership is about coming together across those divisions of perspectives, power, and process to tackle those problems together, to learn about what's going on, to understand each other's contributions and concerns, to coordinate activity, and to adjust and adapt based on how that interconnected system that you're all part of moves and changes. And as Emily said at the beginning, that's not easy, and we'll get into some of the more detailed challenges of that as we go on this conversation. But fundamentally, organizational incentives and power and resource imbalances present real obstacles. It's in everyone's interest to think first about place, but it's in each individual's interest to think first about themselves and their own organization, which makes coming together to do things with and for each other really tricky. And once you're together, the inherent power imbalances can be a real barrier to trusting relationships and collective action. And that's why you need really strong infrastructure, strong culture, strong processes to reinforce those kind of relationships and make that kind of activity possible. And of course, within organizations, you've got loads of that already: HR systems, corporate plans, management hierarchies, norms and cultures of operating. But when you're working across organizations, you're kind of in outer space. There's no, or not necessarily any common structures and infrastructure there unless you make it to be there. And potentially even worse than that, you might have a clash of different expectations and cultures coming from the different sectors and organizations that you're more familiar with working with. So to make collaborative leadership work, you have to invest in the soft and the hard infrastructure to enable people to have the collective bravery to mobilize change. And I'll stop there for now, but there's lots to unpack in all of that.
Gosh, Elle, thank you so much. That was an incredibly comprehensive answer to the question. I'm going to, and you raised so many of the key questions and ideas around collaborative leadership, but I'd love to invite Nick and Liz to add anything to that question of what is it about collaborative leadership and place-based change that is so critical? And if there's any difference of views or additional points that you'd like to bring or examples. Liz?
I'll jump in. We think about it in the Canadian context. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas peoples. Canada's in a process of truth and reconciliation, and so acknowledging the traditional territories and the original and current stewards of the land, elders past, present, and future, is critical to the work that we do at Tamarack and with organizations across Canada. And I want to also acknowledge folks that have joined us from British Columbia. You got up very early today, so good on you. When we think about collaborative leadership within the Tamarack context, we talk about two things I think that are really critical. The first are the mindsets that it takes, and I think, Elle, you touched on this, but there is a mindset to this work, right? And yes, there are barriers when you're coming from an individual organizational domain into the collaborative, but that's a mindset shift, right? That we can do better together by working collaboratively. That is a mindset, and you want to have folks joining you around the table that have that abundance mindset, that have that way of thinking that, that this problem is so complex that we actually need the wisdom of the crowd to be able to move the problem forward or to move the opportunity forward, and that we are willing to be contributors to this, right? And so again, another mindset shift, that it isn't only about my individual organization, but it's the contribution that my organization can make to this and the change that's going to happen in my organization as a result of being on the around the collaborative table. So there's kind of the inward outward part of the mindset. And I think it's also really critical collectively to have the mindset of courage, right? Because collaboration is tough work. Sometimes it requires you to ask some really tough questions. And so that takes courage. And so I think the mindset piece is really critical and something we think a lot about at Tamarack. And then the other thing that we have been considering more recently, and it comes out of the work of Adam Kahane, who is with Rios Partners. And Adam has written a lot of really interesting books, Power and Love. He's written a lot of books around scenario planning, but his most recent book was called Facilitating Breakthrough. And one of the really interesting ideas that he raised in that book is this notion of horizontalness, right? That we all work in hierarchical organizations, but when we come to collaborative tables, it's a horizontal space, right? And so how do we take our hierarchical structures and reshape them in a way that is more horizontal, more generative, more in tune, more adaptive, more agile? And so those are, again, some of those skill sets that I think are really interesting. And so I've been playing around with vertical and horizontal in my thinking around collaborative leadership, and really thinking about what does it take to be truly horizontal and integrative. So that's a couple of thoughts to add.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I love these sort of bringing in the metaphor, the vertical versus horizontal, and it just helps to visualize what a difference it is in the way of working. Nick, I'd love to come to you, especially with all your experience in community organizing, and sort of perhaps taking more of that perspective from community groups. What do you think has made collaboration really challenging so far? And what are the examples that you've seen of sort of collaboration working, and what's enabled it to work?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily. I mean, it's so I think to start with, it would be wrong of me to not set this in a context. And this is a context where actually, when you think about the state of society, we think about the UK, we have, decades of policies that have increased the greater polarization between those that have and those that haven't. We have a climate crisis, we have a cost of living crisis, we have a global pandemic, and we now have war in Ukraine. So actually, all of these are contributing factors. When you talk about challenges, that actually these are the deep-seated challenges that are appearing in many different ways and different forms in local places and communities that are causing people to feel powerless to affect change. So I think in terms of answering that sort of question directly that you put to me prior to around what is required for us to transition, and touching on this notion that actually how do you shift from collaborative leadership how you shift from traditional leadership to collaborative leadership. I think first of all there's going to have to be an acceptance that something somewhere isn't working. And we hear a lot from a lot of places where people will turn around and say, well, the system doesn't work. Well, the system is working in some way, shape or form for some people. It's just not working for those who find themselves on the margins and those most affected by the policy decisions that keep poverty deeply entrenched in a lot of places. So I agree completely with what Liz was sharing, was this notion of shifting mindsets. And I think, first of all, not only is it a shifting of a mindset, but it's actually a starting point to accept that we are part of the problem collectively, that every person plays their part in being part of the problem. So if we want to shift mindsets and change cultures, which are very different things, and actually the latter being much, much harder, very easy, sometimes it's easy to change mindsets than it is to shift cultures, that we need to start with a deep reflection about what part of the problem do I play in this system. And actually, if we all started at that position, I think we might actually start to uncover what some of the deep challenges are. Now, in terms of sort of a starting point on this, I think, it would be wrong of me not to start with something around community organising. And I think, for those that if we took a conflict-based position on this and looked at the work of somebody like Saul Alinsky, who was one of the originators of organising, although we could talk at length about who and where and when organising was originated, actually one of the key things here is that actually any good organizing or any good changing around organization starts with disorganization and disorganizing. I think that comes with a position of actually accepting that the status quo just doesn't work, and that actually we need to start to think carefully and long and hard about actually how our systems are structured and how our systems operate and function, so that actually they can work better with and alongside people rather than just for them. And moving that therefore on, I think what we're starting to move into a conversation here is around this challenge that we're facing around shifting natures and shifting cultures of organizations from this trend of traditional model to more collaboration is one that is deeply rooted in power. And power often relates to challenge, and challenge relates to an inevitable struggle for it, and that may or may not lead to conflict. And I think conflict is something that is deeply shied away from when organizations are involved in this type of thinking. And I think I think it was Marshall Gans who turned around and said, actually, conflict is the midwife of change. And I think we have to embrace it rather than hide away from it. And I think if conflict is managed effectively, then actually, we can start to look at the tensions that exist and how we can move things forward in a positive way, particularly as, to repeat, if it is conflict, it is to be the midwife of change. Ultimately, when we go back to the point of the system not working, and when we start talking about power, we can boil it down to some really simple things. Who has it? Who wants it? And why do they want it? And actually, I think when we start to explore that, we can start to understand the self-interest that drives people. And I think that whole notion of self-interest is really, really key, because we have to accept, and I think that the only way we can move from these traditional models to more collaborative models is where there is to be a common shared interest between all people involved. Why are they collaborating and what are they collaborating on? And I think, we have a situation where societies, if we were to split society into three aspects, and I sort of split it here into sort of what I would call the state, citizens, and the market. Actually, if we're going to try to cure some of the big challenges that we're facing, and actually the deep-seated injustices that are created by various things that happen in our lives, we need to look for the intersection between the state, the market, and the citizen, and look for where there's common and shared interest. Because actually, if we can start to serve the interests of all three of those aspects, the state, the market, and the citizen, I think actually we can start to look at where there may be some sense of collaboration or opportunity to bring about change. Because when we can serve the interests of all three, then actually we might be able to accept that change can come about. So you asked me to root in practical examples of where it's working. I'm yet to see it fully working. I'm yet to see examples yet fully where there is deep parity between institutions and organizations and people, which is rooted in people's democratic participation and the wider functions of our society. But I am seeing, I think, seeds, sort of seeds of growth in some places, and we are starting to see it come through. So I've seen really strong collaborations between grassroots organizations and health bodies and health organizations in Stockport, whereby working together they've reduced the the health inequalities people are facing and actually started to improve people's what it takes to live a good life in those places. I'm seeing in places like North Birkenhead Development Trust where actually they're contributing to decreasing young people's involvement in criminality and criminal behaviour, because they've started to develop a more collaborative working relationship with the police department and with the kind of local policing teams. And of course, also in places like Hartlepool, we're starting to see greater opportunities there for people to work together, to start to think about how they can take ownership of local assets and local opportunities to start to address the challenges that they're facing with around poverty and worklessness. And I think all of that is coming about because in those places, organizations and people are starting to collaborate around self-interest and accepting that actually, what is it that I need to get out of this? And they're starting then to be reflective around their own power, the power that they hold, and how they interface with others. Emily, hopefully that's a starting point to answer the question.
Wow. Well, there's a lot to respond to there. And thank you so much for actually bringing that central point about power, which is so important as a backdrop around whether collaboration happens or it doesn't. And it's always there. And this idea about the fact that, the system is indeed working for those with more of that power who perhaps get more out of the system. I also love your point about self-interest. Instead of trying to turn us all into saints that, or go against our human nature, how can we find ways that all of our respective interests can be met? Difficult, but you've given some good examples of where it's starting to happen. I'd love to also to invite Elle and Liz to share us perhaps some examples from your work and what you've seen of where glimmers of this collaboration that was deemed maybe really impossible 10 years ago is starting to happen in really interesting ways.
Me to go first, Liz. I think we've seen a lot that's been sort of catalyzed by COVID. A lot of the places that we work with saw the kind of power and the strength of their communities and the assets and resources and knowledge that their communities have be a fundamental part of their success at surviving the COVID pandemic. And that's, talking of mindset shifts, I think triggered a kind of reflection on the part of quite a lot of local authority leaders and NHS leaders about how do we do this in the normal times as well as in the chaotic times? How do we embed this way of working with our communities as a more established footing? And there are some really fantastic examples of where that's happening, and there are quite a lot of councils and NHS organisations who are currently thinking about how do we take that forward. But it's not without risk, because for those of you who come from community organisations, I'm sure you would be the first to point out that was a huge strain on community organisations, and was something that was possible to do in that moment of crisis, but isn't a kind of steady state footing. So there's a bit of adjusting to do on both sides. And to speak to Nick's point about how do you find something that sits in that sweet spot between giving everyone what they need to be able to be part of that system and to surface all of the kind of amazing assets that the community has in a way that isn't extractive and that really kind of builds on their kind of unique place in the system.
So you mentioned earlier, Emily, that Tamarack has been working in place for 20 years. And so we have lots of lessons learned. We started early on with a small group of communities in an action learning experiment. That's how we framed it. In our early days at Tamarack, we worked with 12 communities, and we were really experimenting in the early 2000s around, was there capacity in communities to work across sectors to address poverty? And that was the initial idea behind Tamarack. It continues to be our North Star, right? To end poverty in Canada. And so the early experiment was funded by the McConnell Foundation, and we had 10 years worth of funding. So that's really generous and, really enabled us and the community partners to learn deeply about what it takes to affect change, and particularly change around a complex issue like poverty, right? Because there are many interrelated root causes. And we also know that the conditions of each place are different, right? So St. John, New Brunswick is different than Hamilton, Ontario, and it's different than Calgary, Alberta, because those contexts are different. The people around the tables are different. The way that community looks at poverty and the solutions are different. So we learned that local context really matters. We also learned that we could not do this work without the voice of people with with lived and living experience deeply embedded in the process, right? Because they are, in fact, the people that are navigating well or poorly the systems in place in those communities on a daily basis. And so lots of things in the first 10 years. When we got to the end of 10 years, we asked the communities, had we, accomplished what we'd hoped to accomplish? Because the funding ended. It was really generous funding, and, funders move on. But the community said, no, we're not done. There's, in fact, much more to do in Canada. But we had been seeing this drop in poverty rates across Canada, but the community said that there was so much more to do. And part of Tamarack's work was not only supporting communities, but lifting up what they were doing and sharing widely with anyone who was interested in addressing this complex issue of poverty in Canada, in the US, globally, through our learning center. So then the next 10 years, we scaled from 12 communities to 400 communities across Canada, the US, and other places, not just working on ending poverty, but now we've launched Building Youth Futures, navigating climate transitions, and deepening community through neighborhoods, which is addressing social isolation and loneliness. And what we've learned in the poverty work, and I was chatting with some folks in the UK recently about this because they were pushing back, right? Because what we've seen in Canada is a decrease in poverty rates from 16% when we started this work to 6.4% now, right? So we have seen this trajectory of decreasing over 20 years, which is the right thing to see, despite good times and bad times. Despite changes in governments at all different levels, at all different tiers, we have seen this continual decline in the number of people in Canada that have the lived experience of poverty. Now, for some individuals in some communities with deeper poverty and interrelated root causes, lack of stable housing, lack of stable supports for mental health and addictions, those kinds of things, there is this set of individuals for whom that circumstance has not shifted significantly, and that's the group that is now the focus of the work. But it is interesting to think about, what is possible when communities focus, and when you bring this network of communities together in a collaborative kind of way, do sense making together, and really continue to put the pressure on governments at different levels to keep their promises, right, around their investments in community in place, and you start to generate that collective capacity of work. And so I don't know if that's an answer, but it's an example of what is possible, I think. I think what I often see in lots of communities that we support through Tamarack is that there is fragmented and episodic investments, right? And I think it's that kind of collective investment over time with the voice of people with lived and living experience, and the collective capacity of multiple players, multiple places, stepping forward and learning together, and then creating that narrative that says, hey, this is such an important issue, we have to all pay attention to it.
Super, thank you. And that I know that Canada also measures absolute poverty. So in that sense, to go from 16 to 6.4%, what an incredible progress has been made. Yet more progress still needs to be made. But I suppose your point, Liz, that's really highlighted is the power when community organizations come together and their work is highlighted and they're able to garner more power to speak to government and to hold government accountable at different levels. So thank you for that really powerful example. And it takes time. It wasn't doable in over a 3-year period. So,
well, and I also want to acknowledge that there are lots of players in the field, right? So there's the work of Tamarack, but there's Canada Without Poverty. There's no end, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. There's no end of players, and it's the sum of the parts that is really powerful, not the parts in and of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So the broader system. So I'd like to, at this stage, pivot a little bit and go back to something that Elle mentioned earlier, which is some of that incredible leadership and agency we saw through COVID. And a crisis does bring out, oftentimes, happily, the best in us and the best in communities. So this question about sort of, there's leadership within a crisis, and there's community and leadership in the wider sense of the word, as Elle brought out earlier. And then there's leadership sort of that happens collaboratively over a period of time, working together around aligned interests. And then there's perhaps another kind of leadership that's required for much more disruptive times. So I'd like to, again, I'm going to go back to Liz in this case, but then bring Elle and Nick back in, because Liz, you wrote a really interesting and provocative article about the difference between leadership between crisis, collaborative leadership over a period of time, and disruptive. Could you say a little bit more about that? And then I'd love to get Elle and Nick's perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks. That paper was actually written with some colleagues in the United States, the Civic Canopy, that is based in Colorado. We co-authored it. And one of the things that we were really interested in was trying to see what was emerging during COVID. And it builds on what Elle was talking about, and trying to see the types of leadership that was really emerging. And in fact, we have it here. We have it represented on this panel. So we saw a lot in the early days of COVID, and continues still, this really responsive kind of leadership, right? Where people in communities across Canada and the United States really responded to the fact that there were some people that were navigating the crisis really well, but other people that were isolated, that didn't have connections, that didn't necessarily have the resources, and were really impacted early on. And so lots of community organizing kind of efforts that were really responsive and really very community based, and actually met people where they were and brought the whole community together to deliver direct services, whether it was food, whether it was financial, whether it was support to people. And that's really interesting, right? The fact that this really ramped up at the beginning of the COVID crisis in Canada and the US, but it continued on as well, right? And those community organizing efforts, as they evolved during the time of COVID, began to actually connect into organizations and systems within the community. So that was one type of change that we saw. The second type of change had to do with collaborative tables, and Elle spoke to this earlier. And we saw, particularly in the early days of COVID, and continues today, the collaborative table work ramped up because local governments were looking towards something that pre-existed in their community where they could actually go to one place and have a network in place, right? And that network deepened its connections, reached more broadly, and grew its own capacity. And there were investments made in that. And then the final type of leadership that we saw emerge was this notion of disruptive leadership, right? We called it emergent disruptive because some of it was emergent and some of it was really trying to disrupt. And so, I don't know if this is true in the UK and in other places, but certainly in Canada, there was this sentiment of building back better, as we were starting to think we were emerging from the COVID crisis. And the disruptive emergent folks said, no, what COVID has revealed is the deep inequities that we have in society, right? Whether they're racial inequities, whether they're inequities because of access to resources, whether they're inequities because, there are these big gaps in our society, and our society is far more fragmented. So we don't want to build back better, because building back better means we're building things that actually are not addressing inequities, right? And that disruption, that disruptive leadership really started to look at, this opportunity for building back differently, right? For really trying to deepen our our sense of inequity, our way to structure resources differently, to create solutions that are more equitable, that really meet the diverse needs of communities. Now, I would say that paper was written kind of mid-COVID. I would say, it's almost like this thing is, I did a webinar recently about a slow rolling crisis, right? How to end a slow rolling crisis. And it seems like COVID is that, right? It's this kind of slow rolling crisis. And what happens with slow rolling crises is that you kind of get lulled into a sense of complacency almost. And, you're just so tired. And we're seeing this a lot from Tamarack's perspective. We're seeing communities being very tired, being a little bit frozen in their space because they don't know what the future holds, and are feeling a bit frozen in terms of planning, and actually have been resourced to the max, have been having their resources being taken to the max. And so there's almost like we need to ramp it up, and we need to get back to that kind of disruptive edge again. At least that's my perspective.
That's very helpful, Liz. I'm going to invite Nick and Elle to bring your own views on that, sort of the difference there between the sort of collaborative and beyond into more disruptive leadership, and when that might be necessary.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. I think much of what Liz said, I completely agree with. I think COVID was another example of the world facing a material crisis. And what we know from those crises is that it actually creates a crisis of legitimacy within our established leadership and the established order. And I think there's a criticism to be made there to the whole organising movement, actually, for failing to take full advantage of the opportunities that crisis presented to bring about genuine change. Because we know that in times of crisis, actually, it's a time when we should effectively organise ourselves to take advantage of opportunity of that, because I know full well the system will seek to re-establish its order by organising itself. And I think what happened across, certainly in the UK context, was that we've seen glimmers of hope and social movements emerging that are bringing about change. But actually, much of those who were kind of working on the front line of communities who were doing the organising work became much more the frontline responders, actually being there on the ground alongside people, supporting them, and ensuring that their basic needs were met. And rather than asking the questions why their basic needs weren't met, they were actually there dealing with and making sure that people had the food and the medicines and the things that they needed, when actually really organisers that were perhaps better, more well established, may have been asking questions as to why and holding to account in a time of crisis, and actually going bold and asking and pushing for structural reform. They actually found themselves retrenched back to working 16 hours a day, making sure those that were most at risk from the virus were actually protected in when the state wasn't stepping in, particularly in the very early days. So I think actually, there was an opportunity. It's not fully missed, but I think the actual, it's gone. I've lost Zoom. Never mind. There we go. You're back. Sorry, and I panicked. I thought it crashed all over my screen. So the opportunity was missed, but I think actually we can. I think I think my sort of push, and I've said this quite a few times, is I think for those that are advancing or seeking to advance the reform agenda, and to actually shift and change the way in which society functions, particularly those with the very least, that we need to, and I shared this before, we need to build this bigger sense of a bigger we. And actually that encourages, and that means people involved in this need to start to find ways of working together. And particularly for those involved in organising, sometimes it can be very difficult actually to get organising movements and networks to collaborate more in a way which enables everyone to achieve the win that we all desire.
Thank you, Nick. Elle.
Thanks, and I also agree with Liz. I think it's an interesting one, because to a certain extent, all leadership is disruptive. The activity of mobilizing change is about changing stuff that's inherently disruptive. If you're just getting things done, you're kind of responsibly applying your authority perhaps, but you're not really leading something. And collaborative leadership is itself disruptive of the kind of existing culture of focusing only on organizations and outputs rather than outcomes, for example, like saying this is about what we can do together, not what credit I'll get for it. It is a disruptive idea, particularly in the kind of norms of the societies that we all occupy. I think there's also something about the kind of different organizing models that Liz was talking to, and the different transition through the crisis, which reminds me of the kind of Cynefin models that some of you will be familiar with about chaos and complexity and simplicity and order. And it feels like that kind of emergent disruptive leadership is almost best or necessitated when you're at that very chaotic end, where the idea of just do something and take action is so essential, or which was what we saw kind of very early on in the pandemic. There wasn't necessarily a clarity of purpose. There was just a sense of like, everyone do something, we'll all be broadly heading in the same direction because we don't actually know what the right direction is, but let's allow the space for everyone to take action. Or at that very sort of ordered end of the spectrum, where you're thinking about where you've got that real clarity of mission, like in the case of the vaccination jab rollout, where there wasn't a sort of infrastructure of like ordering all the different contributions that people made. There was a plethora of different people stepping in to try and get jabs in arms, or whatever the slogan was that we were living with at the time. But that because you've got that very uncontested, very clear kind of common purpose, you can let a lot of plurality exist within the activities that people are taking. I guess the time that it feels more challenging is all of that more complex adaptive space in the middle, where everything is a bit more contested, and where having a kind of holding environment that makes sure you're surfacing all the different perspectives that are valid, and particularly given the kind of equity concerns that Jo was Liz was rightly talking to. Like, how do you make those trade-offs? How do you make sure that the plan that you're kind of navigating through, or the reality that you're creating in that emergent space, is one that everyone is really on board with, when you've without some sort of thing that binds you together, I guess, and in that more emergent way. And I think that's where it becomes a bit more challenging for me. But I found the paper really fascinating, really thoughtful contribution.
And Elle, I think that's such an important point of question and tension, really, because I think what all three of you have brought out is, on the one hand, collaboration and aligned interest, building trust and engagement is really critical to be able to cooperate, collaborate across sectors. At the same time, often that's not enough, and we need to be more activist. We need to be more in a campaigning, which can be a more adversarial role to play that could erode trust and engagement across parties. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more thoughts from you, perhaps some examples around how to navigate that tension. When, how can someone know where on that spectrum they need to be to bring about the change that's necessary?
Was that to me, or to
I realize not an easy question to really any of you.
I'll let Nick start, because it's really his specialism.
Well, I think it goes back to that point I said at the beginning, that actually, it's down to ultimately change does start when people feel the need to resist, and actually that comes from an individual recognizing that actually they're part of a wider system with a degree of agency to affect change. But equally, that reflection also goes to actually those within positions of power and authority to actually realize that they are part of a system too, and their power that they have actually is time limited. And the only time I feel that change really comes about is when actually those in positions of power realize that their power is time limited, and that actually the relational power of communities is enduring and lasts. And we need to find ways of building that in lots and lots of places. so that people feel able to and are part of recognizing their power to affect change. And I think if that comes about, then actually there becomes a greater respect and a deeper trust between people, because actually people don't take for granted the authority and the power that they have. And I think for too long people have taken it for granted.
Thanks, Nick. And it actually goes to your earlier point about the importance of starting with ourselves. Everyone is an agent within the system, and we all have a role within it, whether we're aware of it or not. Hard to do, but really essential. I'm going to then sort of, I suppose, move on to, we're between the sort of, I think that Liz, you called it responsive versus the more sort of strategic collaborative. And then now we've talked a bit about disruptive, emergent leadership. It feels like, there could be a difference of mindset across those three types of leadership, a difference of skills, a difference of approach, certainly. And I wondered if you could say a few things about what are those types of mindsets and assumptions, skills that help somebody to navigate between collaborative to more disruptive types of leadership.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because I think I agree with Nick in the point that you just made, that relentless dissatisfaction, right, with what the status quo is brings you to the space of all of them, right? So if you think about, the responsive leadership, people are coming together and they see something and they feel that kind of urgency, that tendency to respond and to really bring folks together around that. And so they're kind of coming to that space, recognizing a need and really wanting to fill it. In the middle section around collaborative or collective leadership, I think it is more people and process oriented, where you have people around the table, but you also have this process of collaboration and really trying to determine how we can utilize the competencies of individuals and organizations to drive change forward. And then we just at Tamarack, as part of a conference that we just held, we engaged 4 people to talk about disruptive leadership, right? And these are 4 people that are trying to disrupt from different perspectives. Someone who was the co-CEO of a climate change lab, an individual who is leading an initiative in Canada called Social Economy Through Social Inclusion, a funder who is trying to disrupt philanthropy through participatory grant making, and my colleague Bill Fulton from the Civic Canopy in Colorado, who is also disrupting traditional systems through the work of the Civic Canopy. And they had some really interesting perspectives on the notion of disruptive and emergent leadership that I think is helpful, right? And one is that that in some ways disruptive is a collective activity, which Elle talked about, right? This notion of collaboration is collective work. And so we not only have to make the case for disruption ourselves, but we have to actually make the case for collective disruption to be able to generate even deeper impact. The second part of disruptive leadership is this notion of really pushing against the status quo, right? And so really having the courage and the ability to say, hey, this is not acceptable to us. I led a collective impact initiative in my community in Hamilton. Emily and Joe have heard this story before, and Layla and others. But one of the parts of our mantra that we read out at every single meeting of the Hamilton Roundtable of Poverty for Poverty Reduction was that poverty is unacceptable, and we stand together as a community to tackle the root causes of poverty. And that is so ingrained in my brain, that kind of statement that we read at every single time we gathered, that poverty was unacceptable and that we stood together as a community. to tackle the root causes, right? So I do think there is that kind of pushing against the status quo that is really critical, and to do it in ways that creates this collectivism, that creates this kind of collective way of working and this collective agreement that we're working on. The folks on the panel talked about being aware of performative disruption, right? Which I found fascinating, right? So sometimes we enter into the space and we say, hey, we really want to disrupt the status quo. And yet it's a performative practice, right? And so how do we get beyond that performative edge because a funder has asked us to do it, or we think it's the right thing to do, to really saying, hey, it's not about more, about better resources for people who are poor. It's about net less poor in Canada, right? And that's better resources for people who are living in circumstances of poverty is often where we land, but actually working for the net less of something is, I think, the moving beyond the performative. And so how do we push ourselves beyond the performative practice of disruption? And then I think the final thing that the panel shared and that I also found really fascinating was this inner journey that we have around being a disruptive and collaborative leader, because I think it's probably a little bit of both. And, you know, you have to set boundaries because it's such hard work. And it actually does really ask you, as Nick said so early in the session today, but I agree, you know, you have to ask yourself that hard question. What am I personally doing that is contributing to this problem? Right? So what are the ways that I'm acting, the systems that I'm part of, the thoughts that I bring to this, the perspectives and the actual action that I'm having that actually contributes to the problem? And then how can I shift some of that to be part of the solution, right? And so it is really, I think it's the part of the problem and part of the solution I feel are joined up questions, but it's then also understanding that, you know, there is an inner journey of this, right? And there are boundaries around this that we also have to pay attention to. So yeah, those were some of the points that panel brought up around that disruptive part. So those are my perspectives.
Thanks, Liz. Again, so much to digest there. And I love that term, inner journey. And that feels like it can be incredibly deep. And the question that it raises in my mind is, how can, you know, what are the conditions that allow more people to have that, to be able to go through that inner journey in a bit more safety, you know, be vulnerable enough to allow themselves to go through that and to share some of that with their colleagues when the incentives might not always encourage that. So yeah, lots of questions that are forming. I think several of you mentioned crises and not wasting a good crisis, and how much we learn about ourselves and communities, but also how much can be done. But how, you know, I suppose it makes me think about the fact that COVID isn't over. And I think, Liz, you mentioned that COVID is kind of a slow moving crisis. We're still seeing the effects of that, absolutely. And who knows what it has around the corner for us. But there's another crisis that's really brewing that will get much worse, which is the cost of living crisis before it gets better. And certainly we're seeing the effects of that already in the UK and around the world as well. So Nick, I wanted to come to you to sort of, you know, again, thinking about another very turbulent time. Winter is going to be harder. You know, and what do you feel is going to really be, now that, you know, what are the lessons that we can take from COVID that we can take into this crisis about how the system and we can be better prepared for it and not let this crisis go to a waste?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you know, you've touched a really key point, one which we're actually actively working on, and I think maybe in my response to this, I'll try to sort of share how both what we're doing is an attempt to potentially shift from what you might call traditional leadership in organising to a more collaborative leadership style in organising. So I'm not saying this is how we're organising, this is how systems are working, but this is how in the organising world we're starting to address some of these issues. So cost of living became a primary issue for people across our network and our organisation at the back end of last year, particularly when people who are on people feeling insecure around their work and potentially furloughs coming to an end. Those in precarious employment were starting to feel very nervous about income, particularly at Christmas time. We were seeing rising food bank usage, which was going through, significantly increasing, and also there was a deep concern and frustration people were feeling around prepayment meters. So those who have to top up their electricity and gas rather than paying on direct debit, because they were paying more for their electricity and gas and more in standing charges than their direct debit equivalents. So as an organisation, we ran a campaign previously during the pandemic called Operation Wi-Fi, and what we learned from that was actually in organising, often what is in the organising world, very often organisations and organising models create structures for organising campaigns, and often they're very they can be quite hierarchical and actually quite individualistic as an organisation leading it, because everyone has to be seen as winning. But actually what we did was we created an alliance of organisations that sought to around common interest, which was around tackling it. And what we realised very quickly, going back to my point about cost of living, was that actually the people who were facing the crises on the ground around food and fuel and everything else, actually they were the same people. They were the same people, whether it was food or it was fuel. The organisations that were dealing with them locally were dealing with a multiple range of complex issues. But actually, the organisations that were helping people weren't necessarily collaborating that effectively, particularly at the national scale. So we invited a conversation, and we invited organisations to come together who we'd been working with. We were dealing with food stuff, we were dealing with fuel stuff. We invited them to come together into a conversation in February time this year to say, what can we do together to address this cost of living issue? And what emerged from that was this notion that there needs to be an alliance of organisations established to tackle the crises, some kind of cost of living alliance. And what we did was we opened ourselves up to convene and facilitate that. So as an organisation, we said that what we will do is we will give our time and resource to convene a cost of living alliance. But what we will do is encourage the leadership of other people within the alliance to come forward and contribute in some way, shape or form, so that we're all playing our part. And where we are now, a few months on from there, is we've got 71 organisations that are members of that cost of living alliance, and we are organising around the country cost of living summits, which will bring together people, politicians, policymakers, whoever it might be, grassroots activists, to come together and actually start to look at how they can collaborate on the ground to mitigate the impacts, recognising that actually the cost of living crisis is often something which needs to be certainly out there by big national policy decisions, but on the ground we need to look at how we can collaborate more effectively to actually mitigate the impacts of it. So going back to that point about leadership and traditional leadership and collaborative leadership, the alliance is structured around a model or a framework which actually is around, not only is it every organisation is seen as leading and every organisation is seen as being contributing its part to it, but every person has the opportunity to lead within it. And whilst we played a convening role to be a catalyst for it, actually it's now a collective and a collaboration of organisations and an alliance who are all working together as partners, because the common interest and the self-interest between us all is that actually we know the people we're working with are not only just struggling now, but they will be struggling even more so. And perhaps for some, they won't feel it until April next year when they see the arrears that they're in because of the increased costs and the absence of any form of governance and government in the UK right now. Actually, I very struggle to see anything happening in advance of the Ofgem increase in the energy bills in October, which is deeply, deeply concerning.
Thank you, Nick. And that seems to me a wonderful example of an alliance coming together, sort of thinking about both disruptive leadership as well as collaborative. So, I really appreciate the honesty about the fact that sometimes campaigning can become quite fragmented. within the sector, even though people want similar things. So this idea about how to collaborate better amongst the groups, but at the same time be disruptive in the sense of being more demanding of the broader system seems to be such a necessary step. Thank you for that. I wanted to make sure that there's some time for questions, and there's some great ones that have come through on the chat. And if I may, there's one on here, a question, I think, could Liz elaborate on identifying and setting boundaries to help the inner journey in a healthy and collaborative way?
Yeah, I think what Anna spoke to when she was speaking about this on the panel was really that we can, as communities and as organizations, feel the pressure. And we feel the pressure as individuals, right, that are engaged in this kind of work of disruption. And Anna, it was the co-executive director of Climate Change Lab in Canada, a youth lab, a youth social innovation lab to address climate change. And, you know, she was saying that personally, she felt the burden of, you know, having to be the person who solves climate and the pressure of all of that. And so some of the boundaries are what personally could you be capable of, what is within your scope and your capabilities, and then who do you strategically align with? And I think Nick's example was brilliant, right? So Nick said, our group can be convening, the convener of this and a partner, but we also can create the conditions for everybody to lead. And so that's some of that boundary setting, right? Is to kind of clearly articulate what your role is and then what the roles of others are, and then to be able to lift up others and don't feel the burden of having to do it solely yourself. So those are, I think, healthy boundaries. The other boundaries are to really recognize when you're personally feeling, you know, the burden, and who are the allies that you have that will be able to support you through that process, right? Who are those strategic partners? Who are those people that you go to for advice, for support, whether it's personal support or whether it's broader support? And we all have them in different kinds of ways. And then who are the people that might lift you forward, right? So who are those folks that are slightly ahead of where you are right now and maybe can carry you to the next step so that you don't feel you have to lead? And so some of those things are about, you know, creating those kind of healthy boundaries around yourself and your organization, but also recognizing that there are others out there that are doing work and building capacity in different kinds of ways, and then really creating those strategic alliances or creating the conditions like Nick and his organization did to create the conditions where folks can come together around this cost of living alliance. And I love that idea, Nick, and I'm going to steal it and follow some of the work because we haven't gotten there in Canada yet, but certainly it's a great idea.
Super, thanks, Liz. Elle, I'm going to invite you to add, because you posted some really interesting work that you and Collaborate have been doing that touches upon some similar points. Yeah,
thanks, Emily. For me, I think that kind of personal transformation work is best as a collaborative journey, as might be unsurprising, I guess. But there are, of course, ways that you can do inner work completely by yourself, but partnering with other people, just as you need allies to do the kind of external work, it's so beneficial to have allies to help you do the internal work also. And I think in the leadership practice that we've been developing and the kind of leadership development programs that we've been running, we often talk about the cherish-challenge balance. So how do you hold people tight enough that they feel cherished and that they feel safe and that they feel that this is they can be nurtured in this space? But how do you also give them enough challenge that they're able to see their own weaknesses, their own biases, the frontiers of their own development, because often there's a good reason that we're blind to those, that we haven't had need for them to be exposed before. But that can be really destabilizing and unnerving of an experience, because you're kind of unpacking yourself and discovering the bits of yourself that you love dearly and the bits of yourself that you'd be quite pleased to leave behind or shift and change in some way. And so we've been thinking about what are the types of transformations that people go through as we work with them to transition them from the more traditional forms of leadership that we've been talking about into what we tend to call kind of system activism. And I think activism rather than leadership, in part because of the tension that I raised at the beginning, that people think leaders are someone else. Even when we work with chief executives of local authorities, they often say, but I don't have enough power, someone else must be the one who could make this decision, and they are, among the most powerful people in any given place. So we tend to think about system activism as an activity that anyone can take part in, and a choice that you can make to do that work. And we identified 7 shifts of the system activist, and thanks to Joe for posting that in the chat. And the first 3 are about the shifts in perspective that we think people make or need to make to see mobilizing change across organizational boundaries as a core part of the work. Something that probably most people in this room have already undertaken, but you'd be amazed at how difficult that is for folks who've been encultured in a very traditional way. And so that's about shifting from thinking about your organization to thinking about the outcomes that you're seeking, as in the example that Nick just gave, and in several others that we've spoken to today, about shifting from management to mobilization, that when you're working outside of the context of kind of clear authority structures and well-defined tasks, the management skill sets that we're so familiar with and resource allocation is very ill-suited to this type of leadership, and that you need to be thinking much more about informal authority and influence and generating action by others using kind of persuasive powers rather than applying your power per se. And then the third is about from what we call from me to we, that you a shift in recognizing that change is fundamentally a team sport with collaborative endeavor that you can't do by yourself, and that crucially that your perspective, as we were talking about before, is really limited, that you only see things with your own eyes, and that it's only by working with others that you're going to have a more full, maybe not even completely full, but a more full view of what the problem and its potential solutions can be. And so that you need that really strong self-awareness of what your own strengths and weaknesses are, to be able to kind of think about where to bring in other people, to understand that it's not all about you, to drop your ego, and to be curious about other people and how they see the challenge. And then we see 3 shifts that are about more kind of skills and behaviors, ways of being that people grow and develop as they become more effective at changing systems. So one is about this shift from being an expert to being an explorer, and that system activists recognize the value of evidence and expertise, but that they know that because their challenges don't often have clear answers or even agreed questions, that they're capable of navigating through that sort of uncertainty and confident in asking questions and taking a learning approach rather than having certainty about the answers. And that's really tough for people who've built their whole career on being an expert in something, that they know about social care or they know about climate change, and that they have been promoted and been appreciated by their peers because they had good answers. To suddenly shift into being someone who has moderately good questions is a really difficult kind of sense of self to undertake. And that as an explorer, you're always looking for the things beneath the surface. And I think Liz's example of like, what's the real outcome we're going for here sort of speaks to this a little bit, that you're thinking about underlying power dynamics and values and mental models just as much as you're thinking about what you're seeing kind of on the surface. The next shift in that we see is about delivery, from a very delivery oriented mindset to a co-creation mindset, where you no longer see yourself as the primary deliverer of the outputs and the outcomes that you're looking for, but you see this as something that involves mobilizing multiple perspectives, just as in Nick's example of the cost of living, and particularly marginalized voices and people you disagree with, that you see your job as bringing those people to the table, and that it's not just about what you can do, it's about who you can do it with. And that people with lived experience and is a kind of heart of that skill set. And then finally, in that category of being things, it's about moving from expectations to agency, that you no longer feel subject to the expectations of the way the system currently is, that there are lots of ways of being that you, that the old system that you're trying to move away from forces you to be and do, and that part of changing the system is about saying, I can see those things and I choose not to pay attention to them anymore. I choose to take on new roles, to disrupt norms, to act outside of others' expectations. And fascinatingly, we're seeing this quite a lot in the NHS at the moment. Lots of people saying, but who gives me permission to think about prevention rather than cure? And we're saying to them, well, you do, because that's what you've all just agreed that you want to do. So just do it. You don't need permission. You can take this agency yourself, and have the confidence, ideally collective confidence, to take risks and to use your own judgment. And then the final one, which I almost feel like is at the core of some of what we've been talking about today, is about the shift in mindset and emotional connection, and recognizing that this type of work is really difficult and often quite risky, that doing the unexpected and acting outside of the kind of norms, being disruptive, can be personally really challenging, and that this idea of recognizing that you are a part of the system you're trying to change, so likely you're trying to change yourself, and that you may well change yourself more than you change anybody else, because you are the kind of thing you can most control, and that you need to have a huge amount of courage to bring to that work and to bring your full self to that work as much as that's ever possible, and that the work will involve such deep listening and kind of emotional, empathetic content that you're likely to be personally moved and transformed by it. And I think that brings us back to this question where you started about how do you sustain yourself when you're going through that kind of thing. And I think you need opportunities to step out of the work. As much as I spend most of my day job telling people to step into the work and to be brave and to take risks and to be activist, I think it's also really important sometimes to step away and to have people who are outside of the system that you're trying to change, whatever that means in your context. Maybe they're from a different place, maybe they're from a different sector, maybe they're from a different time in your life, who you aren't being strategic with, who you're just being you with, and spaces that you can go, physical spaces that you can go when you're not doing the work, so that you can totally switch off and not have to be your best self, so that you can recover and rejuvenate yourself, ready to pick it back up again.
Thank you so much, Elle. There is so much in that framework. I've read it a few times, and what strikes me about it is that wherever you are in the system, whatever role you play, it applies. And it's quite universal in that respect. And I love how you bring it back to the self. You started there and you ended there, and that's really helpful. So thank you for that. In the little bit of time we have, I also wanted to bring in another key player in these systems, which we talked a lot about today, but we haven't really addressed as much, are the funders. And Liz, you mentioned at the beginning when you talked about cities ending poverty, the importance of having a long sort of patient funder who even contemplated back in those days 10 years of funding, which sounds unbelievable even today. But just wanted to sort of get any of your thoughts on how could funders be more supportive of, both collaborative but also disruptive emergent leadership and approaches to community and place change?
Great question. I think what we're seeing in Canada, or maybe we're just seeing it at Tamarack, I don't know, are more funders that are stepping into the space where they say, hey, we've funded a number of grantee partners. How can they learn together? right? And we've seen recently, we've been approached a couple of times, or there have been RFIs that are out there from government, from other funders that are looking to create learning communities across the things that they have funded. If they're, around a particular topic area or a particular demographic, we're seeing more and more of that kind of interest. And I do think that there is this a trend, at least in Canada, of trying to understand the deeper impact of the funding, and they are approaching it in a way that they're intentional about what not only the communities are learning or that grantees are learning, but also what are they learning across the whole system of grants that they're making. And I think more of that should be lifted up and shared, and more funders should consider that as an opportunity, because again, it's not about the individual grantees, it's about the collective and the sharing. We've also seen funders invest in capacity building with their grantee partners and being very intentional about that. There has certainly been quite a significant shift in Canada around funders investing with an equity lens, whether it's with Indigenous populations or with newcomers and refugees, or with diverse communities. So the equity-based funding and longer-term funding is coming to the forefront. And then the final thing that we have been seeing is this notion of participatory grant making. Now, I know that in the UK that has been lifted up quite significantly, and in the US as well, but certainly more and more participatory kind of funding practices emerging in Canada, and really not only investing in participatory grant making, but the funder that we're working with wants to lift up the lessons learned and share it more broadly. And so have partnered with social innovation publication called Future of Good to lift up the stories around participatory grant making within Future of Good's articles and context. So I think there are things like that that I see as promising practices that I'm witnessing emerging. I do really think that if we want to get to deep, durable, and resilient change, though, longer term investments are required, and also the opportunity for innovative funding. So here's a really quick story. So we have a funder, Government of Canada, that's investing in our Building Youth Futures work, and part of that investment enables an innovation fund, which are small seed grants to the communities to do innovative practices. And so we seeded in one community through the fund this thing called the Roving Campus, and the Building Youth Futures is to help young people in their journey from secondary education into post-secondary education, training, or work. And so the Roving Campus was an opportunity in a community where the young people who were not on track to graduate showed up every day, but didn't know what they were going to learn that day. And it was tied to the curriculum in Canada, but one day they spent a day at City Hall meeting with the mayor. The next day they were getting job-related skills. The next day they were doing some kind of activism in the community. And so it was such a successful program that 95% of the young people are on track to graduate. That seed money was matched by the local community and by the school system in the local community, and now has leveraged another investment of $250,000 in scaling the seed that was invested in. So I think, lots of times there are these small investments that are made, and we don't look at the opportunity to scale the things that have worked positively in community. And so I think there is also that kind of opportunity that we have in the work that's unfolding to invest more creatively, and then look at scaling, whether it's scaling deeply, scaling across, or scaling up, right? Which are different modalities of scaling. But I do think, there's there's lots of ways that funders can be part of the learning journey and part of the leadership development journey, as Elle has suggested, that I think is really, really critical.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Liz, for those many ideas and also examples. And I love this idea of the innovation funding or innovative funding, which allows for the more emergent ideas to get traction that you might not have seen in a 5-year plan, but with great opportunity that you can be much more agile about. So that sounds like a wonderful example. We're soon going to close, but I just wanted to thank everyone for their comments, and Chris also for your many comments too. Really appreciated those throughout the webinar. And Nick, I just wanted to come back to you one last time, really, about this question about the importance of infrastructure. I think Elle brought up that terminology, but what I feel we're hearing in your examples are even within the community organizing space, which is more grassroots by nature, what you seem to be doing is building infrastructure and capacity quite effectively. So if you could just say one last thing about that, and what are some of the learning that you've gained from your experiences in that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll do it as brief as I can. I think from our perspective, what we're trying to do is build the kind of community infrastructure to support and embed kind of grassroots organizing. And that comes from working alongside very local neighborhood organizations who throughout their historical development would have come probably from people coming together in a place to take ownership and put their sort of flag in the sand and say, we want this community center, this community space belongs to us. However, over time, perhaps those organizations, institutions have become somewhat detached from their communities in some way, shape or form, not through any fault of their own, but through the way in which services and procurement and commissioning has been set up, enabling them to receive funds and grants and contracts to deliver services to people. What we know from our conversations is many of those organizations want to go back to their historical roots, which is around agitating and catalyzing and galvanizing people for change. So that's kind of where we're working. We're working with those very localized organizations who want to kind of rebuild that kind of civic infrastructure of place by enabling people to come together and have a greater involvement and greater say in what happens. And we're trying to proliferate that in as many places as possible by invitation, so that we can work alongside people to strengthen their capacity to organize and bring about change.
Sounds amazing. Well, Elle, Nick, Liz, I can only say a huge thank you. And I see some wonderful comments in the chat too. I'm not the only one that thought that your ideas and your insight, your wisdom, all the things that you shared today has just been so helpful, stimulating, and has led to a lot more questions, which is partly that sort of explorer mode that we all need to be in. So just thank you so much for sharing all of that and sharing great examples as well. And thank you to the audience too. It's great to hear from you. I think there's been some really good links, but we'll send some more resources, some that have already come up through the chat, but we'll put that in an email and send it out to everybody so that you can follow up at your leisure. But again, Liz, Nick, and Elle, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing everyone at future Place Matters events as well. Have a very good rest of the day.